Welcome back to Missing. I am Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. I'm so happy that we're being joined again by someone who we spoke with a little while ago. She's so talented, a great author, a great historian, a great guest. But Tim, before we get to that, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot. And yeah, today we are speaking again with Kate Winkler Dawson. She is a podcaster and a great author as well. She's written a new book that was just published in January of 2025. It is called The Sinners All Bow, 2 authors, 1 murder, and the real Hester Prynne. And this is a fascinating conversation about her work and how she sort of chooses her work and what she finds interesting. And yeah, we just, it's really cool because she dives into these historical mysteries. And I think that interests us in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it definitely does, especially when the topic can be applied to anything that's going on today, something that's relevant to today. And that is the case with this particular writing. And she's examining the death of Sarah Maria Cornell from 1832. And Tim, you had said that this was 2 authors. Now, Kate Winkler Dawson is the primary author, but she has this really cool, unique approach where she is using some of the work and some of the interpretations of this potential crime that Victorian writer Catharine Read Arnold Williams had come up with way back in the 1830s. Additionally, Williams was probably the first author to create a true crime account in the work that she composed called Fall River. So Kate Winkler Dawson is bringing in the true crime genre. She's introducing this character who tells the story along with her. So she's working off of the information that Williams had and making determinations and connecting the dots along with this person from like 100 years ago.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's a very unique approach, and we definitely sort of dig into that part of it in the conversation. And yeah, she's fascinating, and she's great to speak with. So interesting. And she is also the co-host of the very popular Buried Bones podcast with Paul Holes. And she has hosted her own podcasts called Wicked Words and another called Tenfold More Wicked. And she has written other books too. American Sherlock, All That Is Wicked, and Death in the Air. There'll be links to all of this in the show notes. And we really think you'll enjoy this conversation with her.
And if you want to find out more about what she does, you can go to katewinklerdawson.com. Or you could check her out on her Instagram at Kate Winkler Dawson.
And you can follow us on social media at MissingCSM. Thanks a lot for listening, everybody. We're going to break quick for commercial here, and we'll be right back with Kate Winkler Dawson. Welcome back to the podcast, author Kate Winkler Dawson. How are you today?
I'm great. How about you guys?
We're doing great. This is such a cool way to bring in the new year. We're recording early January 2025, and you are joining us for, I think, the 3rd time. You've just been on the show a few times, so you're officially categorized, and I hope you don't mind, as a friend of the show.
Of course. I love that. Is that like a Real Housewives? Is that what that
it is now. Is? That's brilliant. Yep. The Real Housewives of Crawl Space.
Fantastic.
We're going to run with that. We're going to get t-shirts made.
Love it.
Yeah, but there are people out there who might not be familiar with the episodes that you've done with us and your work. So can you fill in those who are listening as to who you are and what brings you on?
Sure. So I am Kate Winkler Dawson, and I teach at the University of Texas in Austin. But I'm also a nonfiction author, and I'm a podcaster. I have 3 podcasts on the Exactly Right Network, and I have written now 4 books. I can't even believe those words are coming out of my mouth, but that's that's what happens. I turn around, I'm on book number 4, and I don't remember. I bet I was with you guys for 2, 3, and then this will be number 4. The first book was Death in the Air, which was about a Looney Tunes serial killer in London who was stuck in a terrible smog with the rest of the city, and kind of, the intersection of the corruption of the government at the time and the serial killer. And then American Sherlock is what we've probably talked about the most, which is about a forensic scientist who worked in Berkeley, California, and solved all of these wild cases. And then the third book was All That Is Wicked, which is about Edward Ruloff, who was a brilliant academic. He was a terrible criminal. And so, not a brilliant mastermind. And so that's a lot about like psychopathy and how we figure out why people do what they do. And then you've got the latest book, The Sinners All Bow.
Which is...
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. You'll do a better job than me, I'm pretty sure, about summarizing it.
Oh, I'm not going to summarize it right now. I'm just going to compliment your choice of titles because that's a badass title.
That's the main character. Sarah Cornell said that. Yep. The Sinners All Bow in a letter. It's just like that resonates, It was her feeling of just the oppressiveness of religion and the corruption of it at that time for her near the end of her life. So, yeah, I thought that was a great title.
Yeah, absolutely is. And I want to get into that story. But first, let me just ask you about your podcasts. What is going on with your podcasts?
Well, the very first one was called Tenfold More Wicked. And I did 12 seasons of that, but it was killing me slowly. I mean, it was an exhausting show to do. And it was one kind of big deep dive for 6 episodes, documentary style, on a crime in history. And I interviewed every, family member who was available and, went on the scene and did a lot of different things. So that went on for 12 seasons. That was sort of the gateway drug into the other 2 podcasts. And one is Wicked Words, which is, currently going on. And I interview, much like you guys do, I interview authors about their books and filmmakers and podcasters. And then probably the most well-known show is called Buried Bones. And that's with Paul Holes, who is a forensic investigator who helped solve the Golden State Killer case, and he became kind of a big deal. And so I kind of tell him a story. I say, this is happening in, 1790. Do you know anything about that time period? And he says, no. And so I tell him this story, and he chimes in to try to help me figure out exactly what happened. So I think those podcasts have been such a different experience for me, obviously, than writing a book, because they're so interactive. And you all know, I mean, people want they'll email you and they'll give you suggestions. It's just such a much more intimate platform. And I enjoy storytelling no matter what the mode is. So I've enjoyed doing all of it, definitely. But I'm happy to be back promoting books and stuff.
Yeah, you just said promoting books, and I feel like everything that you write, especially this one, isn't so much like, hey, come on and promote your book. It's like, hey, come on and tell this story that's very significant, and we can't forget about it. It's getting older, and we can't forget about it because it does have a lot of themes and a lot of cultural threads that still are present today, but just dressed differently. And the way you tell this story is really unique and cool. You introduce another female character before you introduce your main character of Sarah. Can you talk about the first female character that you introduce in this book?
Sure. I actually had somebody who said this was one of the more engaging prologues that she had ever read.
100%.
I get scared because I think people don't read the prologue and they just jump right into chapter 1, and you're going to miss a lot in this prologue if you skip it. So, I was looking for different sources on this story, and I found an author who had written about it and had done a wonderful job on the book. And she was a single mother. She was a poet who was just so incensed about what was happening to the main character of the story, Sarah Maria Cornell, who, was found in 1832 hanging from a haystack pole, that the Catharine Williams, who was the author, decided she wanted to take up the cause and ended up writing a really compelling book. And I pitched her to my editor and said I want her to be like this co-author. And she said, okay. Well, are you going to bring her in or what's going to happen? And I said, well, she's been dead since 1872, so I'm not bringing her in. And it turns out that she wrote the first book of true crime in America. And I had always thought, everybody says Cold Blood in the 60s, which is definitely a touchstone in true crime. But people who are historians in true crime know Edmund Pearson, who is an amazing writer from more early 1900s. And so I was pretty shocked when I read this book because it is an incredible narrative that fuses fact with great storytelling. And so I said, I am so involved with this case, and I'm looking to this woman to help guide me because she had access to Sarah's family. She went to the trials. She, had all of these court records. She interviewed Sarah's doctor. She was all over the place. She was at the farm, where Sarah was found. And of course, I didn't have that kind of access. So I had to first think through, what am I going to bring to the table with this book? And then definitely I wanted to, make sure that when I used her material, I had to double check everything. And that's where we got into a little bit of trouble because I started really questioning Catharine Williams' motives, in 1833 with writing this book to begin with. I know that sounds ominous.
Yeah. Well, how come? What were you suspecting as you went through that book?
Well, somebody asked me the other day, what's the most surprising thing that for you came out of this book? And I said that the Methodists were wild in the 1800s. I just had no idea. My agent was raised Methodist, and she said, are you sure that we're talking about the Methodists? And they had these tent revivals, and there was alcohol and sex, and people got pregnant and speaking in tongues. It was very... I don't even know if evangelical is the right term for it. It was just like spirit, this passion. And Catharine was a very, very conservative, rigid, religious Episcopalian. By the book, she said she was raised basically to be a nun. And so when she encounters a story about a young woman who was a Methodist, who she felt was very vulnerable, and then was preyed upon not just by the minister who is being accused of murdering her, but by the whole church, all of these people who would take the stand and really disparage her character after she died. I think that Catharine, if she had not had an incredible disgust for the Methodist, it grew exponentially with this case. And you could just see it all over her book. I mean, she just was disgusted by it. And as somebody who's been trained by it as a journalist since I was 15 years old, I was pretty taken aback. I thought, wow, her facts are great. Her interview quotes are great. I mean, a lot of stuff lined up with the trial transcripts. But all of that vitriol towards a religion, and especially the suspect, is very off-putting for somebody who's trained as a journalist. And so I just felt like, well, I have enough of a hard time policing myself when I write my books. Now I have to police this woman. And, so it became a complicated because she was such a wonderful collaborator. And at the same time, I just didn't trust her all the time. So I had to keep looking back at there was a lot of stuff that I sort of dug up, and I thought, why is she doing this? Why is she conflating this meeting with that meeting? And I started kind of putting the pieces together, that she really this was supposed to be a big hit job, I think, on the Methodist Church. And it really worked. It was.
And was this because she was disgusted by the misogyny and the behavior, or was it because she was Episcopalian, or was it a combination of both? Like, did she use her religion as maybe the stepping stone to the initial loathing?
I think that it was when we have complicated feelings like that, like hatred, I think it comes from a lot of different ways. Catharine made a very poor choice of husband when she was younger, and he was pretty sleazy. I think she saw a lot of Horatio, her husband, in she went to I think the tent revival is really what changed things for her. She, before Sarah died, was found hanging from this haystack pole in 1832. Catharine had been curious about the Methodists and these wild tent revivals that they would hold jointly with the Baptists. And so she went to one, and she was just horrified by what she considered to be blasphemy, up and down, everywhere. Drunk women who were clearly vulnerable, who were disheveled, speaking in tongues, these super hot young ministers who were seducing them and who clearly had no formal training. I'm not a religious person, but I had to learn a lot here. You juxtapose that with more mainstream Protestant, like an Episcopalian service where you have a minister who is standing behind a pulpit, barely breathing, but still giving you, the word the way that you expect it in a very conservative way. I think she just was outraged by that, the contradiction between the two. She really didn't consider it to be a religion, what she saw at least. And so I think that disgust, based on the way she was raised, based on sort of her own prim and properness, I think, spilled over into the case.
Okay, and I just realized that we've been doing this for 12 minutes and we haven't really told anybody what happened to Sarah Cornell and why it happened and why she's, I guess, commonly known as the Hester Prynne before Hester Prynne became a thing.
Right. So Nathaniel Hawthorne, who's the author who wrote The Scarlet Letter, and created this iconic character of Hester Prynne, went to a wax museum in Boston and saw a depiction of a young woman named Sarah Maria Cornell. And there is a menacing minister, which is a great title for a book, by the way, kind of hovering over her. And he comments on it in his journal, just saying, yeah, that guy, the minister is just repulsive. So he then goes on to write The Scarlet Letter, which is a very parallel type story to Sarah Maria Cornell. So academics believe that was his inspiration, right? This incredible book about misogyny and especially about women turning on other women, to me, is the big message from this story. So Sarah Maria Cornell was 30. She was a factory. They called them factory girls. She was a factory worker. This new wave of independent young women who were leaving the farms and small towns and given the opportunity to work in all of these factories that were peppered along the East Coast, especially in New England, because this is the industrial age, and so you have all of these huge factories that need workers, and the women could be paid less, for less money than the men. It was dangerous, but the work, while it was physically dangerous, it was a different experience for most of these women, and their lives were very tightly regimented, and they were told kind of when to go to dinner, where to live, go to church, all of that stuff. And so Sarah was one of those women. She decides she does not want to be a part of the congregational churches anymore. She wants to be a Methodist, and she encounters Ephraim Avery. What happens after encountering him is up for debate on all sides. She says that, I lived with him and he denies it. He says, my wife took one look at her and said, you can't, work for us. And so this sort of series of events happens that leads her out to John Durfee's farm in what was Tiverton, Rhode Island, is now Fall River, Massachusetts, which is a gorgeous park called Kennedy Park, and right near Mount Hope Bay. So she goes to this farm. There are mysterious letters discovered in her trunk after her death. And then she is found hanging from a haystack pole the next day. And it's immediately declared a suicide until they found out she was pregnant. And then her doctor says she had a very contentious relationship with the father of the child. And so it becomes, a huge mystery where they're trying to prove, the prosecutor is convinced that this sleazy Methodist minister murdered her because she was demanding child support. And again, you all were talking about this at the very beginning. You're talking about relevance with these stories. And this is a story that could happen tomorrow, absolutely, to any woman. And we know that women are at their most vulnerable when they're pregnant. Statistically, women are vulnerable to be murdered when they're pregnant. So this story, that's why this story really spoke to me. So there you go.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
We've mentioned Tiverton, Rhode Island, which is now Fall River, Massachusetts. Can you give us a little bit of background? You said you're going to be doing a tour coming up of Fall River that's going to be broadcast, which is really cool. But can you give us a little bit of a background on what that area was like back then and how it sort of changed or stayed the same since?
Yeah, Fall River, if you've heard of Fall River, it's probably because of Lizzie Borden. And the Lizzie Borden case didn't happen until 60 years after this case with Sarah Maria Cornell. But the Lizzie Borden house is like 3 blocks from where Sarah was found dead. So, Fall River is a very old town. There were maybe 3 sort of ruling families. The Durfees were one of them, which is the farm where she was found. And then, the Bordens were a really big name. There were several kind of bigger families, but it was turning into a factory town. You had these industrialists come in and build factories, and the women would kind of flow in and work there and live at these boarding houses in the area, and would kind of travel back and forth between the boarding houses and whatever factory and they worked in. And Sarah worked at a factory in Fall River, and so the lifestyle for everybody there was rural areas, there were taverns. It was definitely a growing city. But Tiverton at the time, before the border moved and there was a big, shift with the border between Rhode Island and Massachusetts, it was a place I think that was considered relatively safe. And for a young woman walking around by herself at night on a cold December night, it wouldn't have been unusual.
So what was the evidence that led them to change the determination from suicide to murder?
Initially they found her and she was hanging from this haystack pole, and they assumed suicide because they just thought, I don't think anybody thought that this was how you would murder someone, first of all. And I don't think it just occurred to them in this area that that's what have happened. And her physician came to the location and said she was pregnant. She was having a lot of conflict, a lot of problems. She was kind of in turmoil. Sadly, this might be suicide. So this is when I start talking about heroes. I mean, I write an awful lot about men killing women. And and even though I have that story here, obviously, I really wanted to try to focus on the women as much as I could, because I don't think we do that enough in true crime. And so I always look for heroes, and we have both men and women as heroes in this story. So when they decide they're going to go ahead and bury her and have a small ceremony, the matrons of the town, this is very traditional, they are asked to dress her. So they take off her clothes, which are ripped and dirty and muddy and all kinds of stuff because she had been hanging there all night. And they notice a lot of marks. One of them called them the results of rash violence. And they recognized it. They didn't say anything for a while, to a point where she actually was buried. And they weren't sure what was happening, but they dressed her and she was buried. They asked initially, though, for John Durfee, who was the man who found her on his property, to go to her boarding home and retrieve anything that they could. I mean, they needed clothes for her. They were trying to get contacts to talk to her family. And he comes back with a trunk that the landlady sent with him. And it had some really, thank goodness Sarah was such a smart woman, some really key things. She kept a lot of letters from her family back and forth. She also kept anonymous letters. And it was a series of anonymous letters of somebody who said, meet me here, we will settle all of this, presumably the father of her child. But they were never signed, and they were sort of threatening. And so she kept those. She kept a note. She had a note in her trunk that said, essentially, if I go missing, find Ephraim Avery. He'll know where I am. And over the years, it certainly has been interpreted very ominously. Catherine and I, neither of us think it was particularly ominous in that way. She was in a great mood when she was leaving the house. She really thought she was going to get money. She was going to get child support. That's what he was promising to her. So I don't think no one had the impression that she was scared of what was going to happen. But I think it was, Catherine said, well, she's a very conscientious young woman, and she left a note basically saying, don't worry about me, but if you are worried about me, I'm with Ephraim Avery, the Reverend Ephraim Avery. But that note is what clued a lot of people in that this might not have been just a suicide. This could have been murder. And so her body's disinterred, and it just keeps going on. She's buried and then disinterred one more time. And, they're picking up clues, but there's just not a lot of forensic evidence, unfortunately. There is an ominous note. There are anonymous letters. There is the doctor who said that, she's pregnant and in a terrible position right now. And he also says that the father of her baby tried to get her to take a poison with a dose that would kill her. So I know it sounds silly, but that's all circumstantial. There's no real evidence against this minister. And so this begins just like an epically long battle in court, but also in the court of public opinion over a woman who is really being framed as, frankly, a slut, and promiscuous and not even deserving a trial over, versus a lascivious Methodist minister who, represents the worst of that newfangled religion that nobody trusts. And so it's a battle between these two different factions.
And today we have such quick access to information that obviously wasn't present back then. How did the word spread about this from her learning about her pregnancy? And did it spread in the town where like slow little pockets of communication were happening and just like creeped up on her?
I think that there were town hall meetings. There were an awful lot of town hall meetings where the residents would get together. There were committees. They were called committees of citizens who, were meant to go out and track down criminals. And so, Ephraim Avery had to be tracked down a couple of different times. And the media played a big part. There's a lot of newspaper articles out there that talk about sort of this menacing minister and what he might or might not have done. But I think that the gossip mill certainly churned really quickly. Between these towns, you're talking about, there's Fall River then and Tiverton then that were close together, obviously the same area. And it's just spread everywhere. I mean, everybody knew about this story. And when he is finally brought to trial in May of 1833, it is just jam-packed, as you can imagine. So there's a lot of information. It is certainly not social media posting, but it is, in some ways, to me, much more damaging, because it is not the quantity of the information that is passed around like it is today on social media, these stupid little troll blurbs that you read. It is more of like very long, influential, deep-rooted, disgusting biases that like just get drilled into everybody in a town to influence, the way that they view Sarah or view Ephraim Avery. And so that really to me is that, much like in the Scarlet Letter and what happened with Hester Prynne, women were the ones who were passing all of this along. So for me, there are women who are heroes, but truly the Methodist Church is not great in this story, and neither is Ephraim Avery, of course, but the women are what really disgusted me in the story. When you take women on the stand lying to try to get this guy off, and that's really what was horrible to me.
So what else do we know about this Reverend Ephraim Avery?
Well, I know more. Catharine didn't bother digging into him at all. She really hated him. And that's, that again is when I realized I was working more with a poet and less of a journalist. She did things correctly. Like I said, I mean, she had wonderful interviews. She asked great questions. But the way that she crafted the story was very much like, I'm not even going to talk about him. We have to talk about him. And what she did talk about was some pretty, I think inflammatory stories about Avery kind of drumming another reverend out of town in a humiliating way because he felt threatened, humiliating one of his congregates at a different church because she was standing up to him. I mean, the lasciviousness, the rumor that he would disappear behind the door of his study at night with some young congregant, and God knows what happened. God knows what happened with Sarah if she, when she lived with him. So Catharine would drag out these stories that sound really bad. But then, you would hear testimony that he was a family man and he actually seemed very kind. And you don't know who to believe. And it's very difficult for me when I'm not even sure how much I should believe my co-author in this situation. But, Ephraim was a young minister, up and coming. He ended up with a bunch of kids and he had a wife. who was devoted to him. And just like a lot of other Methodist ministers, he didn't have a great home base. He would move from place to place. Bristol, Rhode Island was one of his favorite places. And, he lands in New England and just stays and is establishing himself as a well-known minister. That being said, I think that the Methodist would have defended any minister, whether or not he was gifted behind the pulpit or not, because they were desperate to make sure that people understood that they were not a bunch of sleazy people, that young women were safe with them. And if he were convicted of murdering Sarah Maria Cornell, it would have been a real black eye for the church. So I think Ephraim Avery is a little bit of a mystery. I ended up getting a hold of one of his family, an Avery, a family member who is in Ohio. And he was able to give me a lot of information kind of about life later for him. But I think he was a bit of a mystery. You'll see some of the drawings where he's just wearing like what they called shades, which are kind of tinted glasses, circular glasses. And I don't know. He definitely has he's not the old cleric that you picture, at the head of a church. Certainly, I mean, I understand why I think the mainstream Protestants were a little threatened. He grew very old, so I have a picture of him when he's old, and he looks just as sort of, I don't know, unsavory to me.
So you talked a little bit about the forensics at the time, and your other book, American Sherlock, is about forensics, and you have this cool comparison because there's, I guess, a theory or these indicators that maybe Sarah had killed herself to set up Avery, and you use this cool comparison to the work you did in American Sherlock. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think one of the things when I thought about what am I bringing to the table, as I had mentioned before, Catharine has all of these great interviews, and she was given a lot of access to the factories where Sarah worked, to her family, to these letters that no one else has read. And so I thought, well, what am I doing to move this story forward? Because I didn't trust her enough to say, I want to know for myself whether or not Sarah took her own life or whether or not she was murdered. And if she was murdered, was it even Ephraim Avery? So I decided to do what we do on Buried Bones, which is, I give Paul Holes information, and he'll say, well, of course, today we would have been able to do this, this, and this, and then there would have been a CCTV on that tree over there and, all of that. But it's more so like kind of figuring out what makes sense. And one of the things I was actually impressed in 1832 with some of the theories they came up with. So when Sarah was found hanging from a haystack pole, the knot at the top of the haystack pole was tied in a square knot, which is the only knot I know how to tie. And then the knot around her neck was a clove hitch. So if you're a true crime fan, you might know a clove hitch because that's what Dennis Rader, BTK, that was his sort of preferred knot. Sometimes it's called a mariner's knot, a sailor's knot. So you have this knot, and immediately we have a couple of mariners who are there on the scene when she gets cut down, and they say she could not have done this herself because a clove hitch has two ends and you have to be able to pull it somebody else would have had to pull it the way that it was positioned. And so Catharine took this as gospel. I mean, and it was like open and shut for the prosecutor based on just this knot. And I talked to Paul and I talked to a forensic knot expert, and they both said, yeah, you can do it by yourself. And actually, Paul said that he saw a suicide that was an accidental clove hitch knot. The woman did not intend, he was sure, to tie it. And sometimes it can just happen in a struggle. So it was interesting, to kind of look at the different clues they had. They found some broken combs. They had, which could have had DNA on them. They had the rope. Would that have had DNA on it? There's all sorts of things they would have been able to pull. But back then, they really were trying to determine when she got pregnant. That was a big thing because he said, I had nothing to do with her in that way. And, she had told her family, this is what happened. She says, actually, it was a sexual assault. And conventional wisdom has been that they had a relationship. They didn't have a relationship. She says they didn't. Her family says they didn't. I mean, he certainly says they didn't. she was pretty repulsed by him from beginning to end. So the measuring of the fetus, I talked to a pathologist who said it's pretty accurate what they did in 1832. I mean, it seems pretty spot on based on the length of the fetus and the weight and, various other things. And so they really were working hard. They were trying with handwriting analysis. They didn't have anybody who really understood it very well. I actually hired a modern day handwriting analyst, one of the best in the country. And she looked at, the different letters and gave me a pretty good determination of who she thought wrote the anonymous letters, because the defense had accused Sarah of mimicking handwriting, in these letters. And she was, of course, like you said, accused of being a crazy woman who had gotten herself pregnant by someone else, not Ephraim Avery. And she was furious because Ephraim Avery had refused to give her what's called a certificate of good standing, which meant, she's had some troubles in the past. She had some thefts. She stole a few things. But I think she's fine and she can join your church and she'll be a good member. And he said, I'm not going to do that. And so, all of his supporters said she was so incensed that he was torpedoing her ability to go to any other Methodist church that she had threatened to take her own life and frame him, which has happened. It has happened in history. I've done cases like that. It's not out of the realm of possibility, for sure.
Yeah, and that was a crossover there that I had mentioned. I find that so fascinating that, well, first, you've made the connection. You're working on this, and then you make the connection based, to a previous work that you've done, which I think is super cool. And also what it takes for someone in her position and all of the people that we're talking about who have been set up in a situation where they feel like they need to take their own life in order to give that other person like the just due or whatever,
Right.
I mean, all of those circumstances have to be so extreme. I don't know. It's mind blowing to me. How often does this happen? And even if you wanted to give the example of the one that you use in
Cora,
American Sherlock,
yeah. So the case you're talking about that I mentioned in American Sherlock that my forensic scientist Oscar Heinrich had worked on, that's what made me think about this case. So that took place in 1928. So back in the 20th century here for a brief moment. 1928, there's a woman who calls the police and screams that her husband's trying to kill her. He has a shotgun. They get there. She is dead with a shotgun wound under her chin, and she's sitting in a chair. They arrest him, and immediately the defense attorney calls my forensic scientist and says, can you come and look at this case? So he starts looking around and figures out that he found a very small piece of wood that he says he believes she used to prop up, to be able to kick with her feet, to take her own life, to set up this husband. And he said, and he could have proved this easily, definitely. He said with the trajectory of the bullet, that's exactly the way it would have been. I would not have thought a woman with a shotgun, would have been able to do it. But he really, like with drawings and stuff, was able to show it. And it made sense once you started learning about their relationship was absolutely terrible. And she was just distraught. He had been cheating on her. She had been wealthy. He was trying to take her money. And I think that thought process was just like, I am done with this and I don't want to be here anymore. And I'm going to take you with me. And it almost worked. And he was arrested and eventually cleared because of Oscar's evidence. And then ironically, he was murdered by his second wife in a kitchen. Not the same one, but I mean, just like this sort of thing, this happened. And so I would not have believed Ephraim Avery's attorneys and those accusations. Probably I would have said that is too far-fetched had I not known about Cora Mead, as well as other cases where that does happen. So yeah, I mean, I think you have to consider all of those sources. But then Sarah writes with such passion about religion to her family, and she specifically talks about suicide. She talks about the horror she saw of witnessing several different, acts of taking their own lives, and she really felt like it was a sin. And it just would not, it doesn't fit her character. It doesn't mean it couldn't have happened, but it wasn't fitting in with what she was saying to other people. She felt so strongly about not taking her own life. And no one had ever said, except for the people that defense was calling to the stand with zero credibility, no one was saying she's ever talked about taking her own life. So that's part of an investigation. You have to do victimology. Who is this person?
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. It seemed likely that she was not expecting to be murdered when she went to meet him, right?
Yeah, she left in a great mood. I mean, that was another argument against suicide. She left in a great mood. She said, "I'll be right back. Don't worry, I'm not going to be gone. Even if it gets dark, I'm not going to be gone that long. Everything will be fine." And then she left that note. And so all of that put together does not, her doctor had said, "I think you need to confront him. I don't want you to do it by yourself." So, that is for me the frustrating part. It is what I come back to. It's not blaming the victim. It's just going, oh my gosh, I just wish somebody had said, "Let me go with you. Don't do this by yourself." Even another woman. I mean, it's just because that could have stopped this, but also we don't know.
I don't want to give away too much of the story, but there was a trial, right? And without giving away too much, can you just give us some of the maybe highlights or some details of the trial?
Yeah, legal experts say that this is the first case they've ever seen of victim shaming in courts in America. And so what you have is a battle of forensics, I think. So you've got at the beginning the prosecutor who unravels a lot of information that is it's a methodical case against Ephraim Avery. He had one of the dumber alibis that I've heard of, which is I describe him going on like a walkabout in a park where nobody recognizes him. And so he has no real alibi. There are lots of witnesses who describe a tall, lanky guy wearing a large kind of top hat, but nobody can identify him directly that night. Even John Durfee, the owner of the farm, saw him or saw somebody that looked like him. So there are a lot of witnesses. There are witnesses that heard screaming. The prosecutor said, that we have doctors who can say definitively that she was pregnant when she said he sexually assaulted her, and that was it. And the circumstances were that Ephraim Avery was a sort of not violent, but he was somebody who, was very ambitious, and she was threatening him and his marriage, and that he turned on her, and, that these letters were certainly linked to him. There were witnesses who said, he paid me to deliver these letters, and it was like a pink envelope. And so the problem with all of the evidence was it's kind of like what I say is squishy. It just is not, none of it was definitive. Yeah, it looks like him. Okay, but is it him? Well, I don't know. Even the matrons who dressed her that day, the prosecutor said to one of them, "Do you think that he killed her, Ephraim Avery?" And she said one way or the other, essentially. And that is a non-answer. I mean, she's essentially she's saying either he actually did it or his actions sexually assaulting her caused her to take her own life. That is not particularly helpful in a court of law, but it was I think the way a lot of people felt stuck in this case. And the defense said she was a thief, she could never be trusted, she was insane. She acted erratically at times. Sometimes she acted just fine. She had several different venereal diseases. She slept with a lot of men, even though she essentially told her family, the only man I've ever had intercourse with was Ephraim Avery, and that was not voluntary. So it was a parade of what I consider to be just vile women taking the stand and saying, Sarah told me that she's always been a bad girl. Sarah told me that her brother-in-law was in love with her and not her sister, and that she slept with her brother-in-law. Things that were never proven or were so vague. But we also know, I mean, even in our time period now, all it takes are some catchphrases and a tone to just have gunk thrown at you and your character impugned. And that's what happened here. It was not the defense essentially just said he wasn't there. He never slept with her. He really didn't even know her. She was, a loose woman, and he wouldn't vouch for her, and she got mad, and that's how this happened. And that was enough of a defense at that time.
Wow, that's wild. Can you tell us a little bit about the handwriting analysis? And I understand that's pretty subjective, just having covered the John Benet Ramsey case in depth. So yeah, just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I talked to, for American Sherlock, I talked a lot about handwriting analysis in that, your handwriting can change based on medication, based on the pen you use, based on did you hurt your hand that day? I mean, all sorts of things. But there are consistencies. And so when I hired this handwriting expert, I said, I have these anonymous letters. And then I have samples of Ephraim Avery's handwriting. And then I have samples of Sarah's handwriting. Can we do a comparison to see what you think about Ephraim Avery's handwriting compared to, the anonymous letters? And, she said, yeah, I'll take a look at everything. And so, she looked at it and she said it was interesting because she had received an anonymous, she looked at one of the anonymous letters and Sarah had transcribed it, this anonymous letter, and sent it to her family just to say this is what was happening. And she said it's interesting. I've never had a case where I've had the victim actually write word for word the anonymous letter or, the document that was being questioned at the time. So she said I could literally see the differences between her handwriting on one word and that same word on the anonymous letter and how different they were. And then she said, I have all these charts, to show what it was. And then she showed me these charts and she said, you're looking for key things in loops and, and different parts of whether or not somebody consistently closes up their A and, or their G is longer. And she showed me these charts to compare the anonymous letter with Ephraim Avery. And I mean, I not to give too much away here, but it was pretty convincing. She was able to say, look at Sarah, look at Ephraim, look at the anonymous letter. And then she showed me one other letter from some random person. And you can see the difference in the G's. You can see the difference in the H's. And she said 1 or 2 times with a missing gap is an anomaly. But if every time you write G and there's a gap at the top, that's a pattern. And you use that pattern. That's all there is to it,
So as we wrap up the conversation, you use the concept of advocate in the book, and you say that, Catharine was an advocate. I believe, you're an advocate for Sarah. Can you just open that up a little bit more? How you see yourself and how you see yourself relating to Catharine as advocates for this?
Yeah, it's hard. I've never called myself that before because as a journalist, I don't think you're an advocate for anyone except the people you're writing for. I've always thought of my job as receiving facts and information and emotions from people and anecdotes and taking all of that and creating a story that people can read and say, okay, well, I didn't care about basketball, but now I do because she crafted this story about this basketball player, who overcame all of these odds. So that's always been my job. And when I read the story of Sarah Cornell, I thought, well, Catharine is clearly an advocate. I mean, when I say she's an advocate, and I get the impression from that because she would do things that I would not do. So she would say that Sarah had met with Dr. Thomas Wilbur twice, when actually I look at the trial transcripts and his actual interview, and they had met 4 or 5 times. So she's conflating a lot of these meetings together. When Sarah is accused or admits to thieving, it's like 3 or 4 times, but Catharine calls it 1 time. And all of these are motivations to advocate for her. I think Sarah had to be not the perfect victim, but as close as we could get, of a woman who was vulnerable, did no wrong, didn't deserve this, And I think all those things are true. But in the society of 1833, if a woman thieves one time, that can be forgiven. She made a youthful mistake. More than that, it's a pattern. So you have to really think about it when you are, proclaiming to be a journalist, and at the same time, you're wanting to protect the centerpiece, like I really did want to protect Sarah. But at the same time, as a journalist, I have to say, okay, by the end of this book, I have to make a decision. Who do I believe? Do I believe Sarah, or do I believe Ephraim Avery? And by the end of the book, I certainly believe Sarah. And so I was able to, I feel like, get into a point where, I gave him a fair shake. I put out all the information that the defense provided. I think I framed it in a way that is kind of dispassionate about you reader have to feel like this. But just the facts. A 30-year-old woman who's pregnant, who's asking for child support, and she's dead. It's hard to get around those optics. And so by the end, I was like, well, fuck this. Of course I'm going to advocate for her. I think she was murdered. And I certainly didn't intend to start like that. And then so I understood how at the end, Catharine, I kind of looked at it at the end, and I went back and I said, she did something. She was trying to do something that was admirable. Protect this young woman, which was unusual because in 1833, Catharine was from a very affluent family. And defending a woman who had been accused of being a thief as well as, sleeping around was pretty unsavory. That was a big risk for her to take, and she did it. But being this fierce advocate, I was always sort of questioning and saying, you can't be really an advocate and a journalist in that way. Like, you have to look at things a little more even keeled. But by the end, I was saying, well, there's no getting around this. Like, I hate him, and I want to protect her. So I don't know what that means about me, but I wanted people to understand the truth about this story, and I wanted to be able to say that people have always villainized this guy, right? Because he's sleazy. And I wanted to give it a fair shake. I wanted to look at the evidence and take me wherever the evidence was going to go. And to me, the evidence at the end led to murder. And I don't think anybody else could have done it but him. So that was my journey.
Wow. Well, that's amazing. Yeah. Thank you for sharing everything here in this interview, and congratulations on the new book. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Where do you prefer people to pick up a copy?
Wherever you buy books. And I have it available on audiobook. I read the audiobook too. So and I love libraries. So libraries are great.
Great. Very good. Do you have another book in the plans?
I am finishing up my first fiction mystery thriller.
Oh.
Which is like, cool. We can't even talk about that right now. That is a whole other animal, a nightmare night, black bear of an animal skulking around at night. It's a completely different world, writing fiction where I kind of go, is this over the top constantly? Is this too much? With nonfiction, you're restricted. Sarah is who she is, and Ephraim Avery, all of my characters, I can't make up stuff about them. But in fiction, you can do whatever the heck you want. So that's a little dangerous sometimes.
Whenever that's ready, you're more than welcome to come back on yet again and provide us with more of this insight and such a great conversation. And yeah, we'll encourage everybody to pick up not only The Sinners All Bow, but all of your other books. Yeah, they're really fantastic. And you had said you're not sure what that means about yourself when you're describing that advocate thing. Yeah. It means you're a really good, excellent writer and journalist. And I love the fact that you are managing to, balance the journalism part with the emotion part, because you can't not put that into the writing. And it's really good.
And I went to a graduate school where they said, you cannot have any feelings at all. And I just thought, what? How is this going to work? Just give me my degree, man. I don't believe that. You're a person. If I've been bitten by a dog, don't put me on a dog bite, case, probably. You have to, you're a human. So yeah, I agree. Well, thank you guys. It's always wonderful to be with you.